Okay, so here is Color Culture Lecture 2, and this is about Platoon. And you'll see the difference immediately between these two films. I think that we tend to think that one is realistic and one is unrealistic. You know, when you see Top Gun, you think, wow, okay, that's what it is to fly one of these jets. And then you see Platoon, you think, okay, that looks like reality. You know, it's gritty, it's shitty, it's bad. This must be reality. Okay, and we're going to sort of look at that. And so I'm going to start by talking about the way that this film does a good job of capturing what is called the Vietnam experience. Because what you have to realize is that when people are fighting a war, they don't all fight the same war. World War II was in no way the same for all the people who participated in it. For some people, it was this. For the Marines, if you're an American Marine fighting the Pacific Islands, that's it. I mean, if you survived, that's all you did. You fought. Well, not all you did, but what I'm saying is, that was your war experience. For parts of the army that were landed in southern Italy and fought their way up Italy and into Europe, that was their experience. So the wars were very different. The same thing is true with Vietnam, where when you go to Vietnam, when you were sent to Vietnam, whether you volunteered or were drafted, whether you went in 63, 65, or 68, or 1970, all these things are very different. What service arm you were in. So there is no one Vietnam War. The feeling about Platoon is that this is the experience that represents an enormous part of the the American soldiers' experience in Vietnam. But when we talk about American soldiers here, we're talking about American infantry, American army. Unlike the Marines, which we'll see in Full Metal Jacket, let's say. What's the difference? Well, the army mostly, especially later in the war, were draftees. You had to join the Marines, but you were drafted. You could be drafted into the army. In Chris's case, in the case of Chris Taylor, our main character, played here by a very young Charlie Sheen, and this is his his main starring role that will put him on the map. He joins up, and this represents to some extent Stone's own experience. So Oliver Stone, right? So who is he? Well, born as many of the men who fought in Vietnam and women who went to Vietnam as nurses, or in some support role because they did go, by the hundreds and the thousands, was born in 1946. In other words, he was a child. This is when people say, okay, boomer, this is the boomer they're talking about. Somebody who was born, this is the first wave of the baby boom. The men come home from World War II in America, and really it's America, to Britain, to Canada, to America. And there is an enormous population boom. And it isn't just 1 year, it occurs. And this is the surge in population, which combined with ongoing growth, industrial growth, is going to create this, up until now, unprecedented era of economic stability and employment in the United States, where all will do well. It's this idea of, the same tide lifts all boats, and all boats do rise, including people who were in the working class who become the middle class, partly based in reliable manufacturing jobs of the kinds which have now been moved overseas, and so on. So Stone is part of this generation. In 1967, when he's 21, Stone drops out of Yale, one of the famous Ivy League colleges, schools, universities, which you've heard of, and enlists in the U.S. Army. He doesn't enlist in the Marines, he enlists in the Army. So he's deliberately planning to go to Vietnam and be a grunt, basically. And it's a very unusual move, especially in '67. At this point, the people who join and go to Vietnam have already gone, mostly. Very few people at this point are joining because they choose to. Most are being drafted. Many are African American, and there will be a disproportionate number of African Americans in the front line at this point because partly because of systemic racism and partly because they have very little schooling, because they're from brutally poverty-stricken parts of the United States. So they have had probably very little schooling, and as a result, basically are not useful to the Army except as trigger pullers, basically, as what they called a 1-1 Bush, a 1-1B, which is soldier, infantry. Stone is in Vietnam for 15 months. That's a very unusual amount of time. The typical tour was 12 months. You were rotated in and rotated out on the same day. So if you arrived in Vietnam on September the 1st, you left Vietnam on September the 1st, exactly a year later. So it was so-called the war year. Stone opts to stay. He is awarded a Bronze Star. We don't know for what, and a Purple Heart, which means he was wounded in action. And once he's discharged, he attends NYU. And NYU at this time, and still, is the hotbed of sort of new thinking, new academic thinking. Like if you wanted to be at the place where it was all happening, where the most intense discussions about America's place in the world and whether Vietnam was the right war to go to and so on, you went to NYU. That's where he goes, and he graduates in 1971. So he's not fooling around, and this is very much the picture of many of the vets who came back from any war, is that when they chose to go to school, they really dropped anchor. That's what they did, and they did it with a kind of consistency and diligence that they had gone to war. Basically, the war trains them. It's a very different. The veterans who came back from World War II and went to school in Canada and in America from World War II were extremely focused, for the most part. He writes Midnight Express. He's trying to get a ticket, basically, to direct, and eventually gets to direct Salvador, which will be his first film, which is still very much worth seeing. It lionizes Robert Boyle, the James Woods character, but it's a very important film, and it's an early film in terms of Americans beginning to look at their own policies, their own foreign policies, and see how they affect the world, basically. And it's an adventure movie, I suppose. I mean, it's very compelling, and well worth seeing. Okay, so that means that this film, then he decides he wants to make his film about Vietnam. And he takes the film around in Hollywood. At this point, he has contacts. And Hollywood is like, we're not making Vietnam films. They bomb. People don't want to see them. And this, in general, has been true. By the time we get to the mid-'80s, which is when Stone is looking for money to make Platoon, Hollywood is finished. The only way it's going to agree to make a film about Vietnam, because that has such a bad odor to it, is to make something like the Chuck Norris movies, or the Rambo films. In other words, revisionist history movies where basically, as Rambo says famously in the second film, do we get to win this time? And that's the that's the movies they were making. Yes, we get to win this time. Okay. So do you get to see Americans kill a lot of Vietnamese and win? Yes, that's what the people wanted to see. But when they read the Stone's script, they were like, no way. Where the young man goes to war and has a terrible time. We're not making that movie. And so he has to go to Britain. And he goes to Britain for the money, and he finds the money in Britain, which is ironic in the extreme, because, of course, then it's going to go on to win an Academy Award, a couple of Academy Awards, and Stone is going to become famous because of this film. Okay, so these first two clips basically will put us into this scene, and I'm showing them to you to indicate the ways in which a number of veterans have identified, basically looking at this film. The film really gets it right. Part of it is that it's a ground war for these guys. They're in the air very briefly, and then they're on the ground. And although they may be flown around in helicopters, which it depends on where you're stationed and what kind of war is being fought, which differs from place to place. Mostly, if you were an infantryman, because we're only infantrymen, you were on the ground, and you weren't getting into the air. So we start off in the air, and we're flying. It says, somewhere near the Cambodian border. This is also a politically hot topic, but we'll let it go. And then they're on the ground. So we're above the jungle, and then we're below the jungle, looking up into this enormous triple canopy jungle, which is the Vietnam is famous for, and many tropical countries are famous for in Asia, of having this enormous these jungles are just incredible biomes, and they are walking. And again, this is the job of the infantry, is to walk, and in this case to walk and look for Vietnamese and draw Vietnamese fire so they can get into firefights and kill Vietnamese. That's pretty much the policy at this point. So we're going to go from the helicopter, and we're going to be in the jungle, and then we're going to be looking up as opposed to looking down. There are two other times when we will look down at the jungle from up in the air. Once at the church complex, and once when Chris is leaving Vietnam. Otherwise, we will be on the ground. So have a look at that. And then look at the physicality of the jungle, and you can see just how incredibly difficult this terrain is. It's hot. It's 120 degrees. It's humid. It's the heat is just it's astonishing what the heat is like. Some of you have been in Southeast Asian jungles or in the tropics. And remember that this is enclosed. Essentially, the jungle traps the humidity, so it's just a big, wet, hot area. And the men are carrying these packs, and so Chris, at one point, they're cutting their way through the brush, this elephant grass, and you'll see him do this with his hands. It's because he's touched the edges of the elephant grass, which will cut your hands up. This is the same experience that the Marines had in the Pacific in World War II, which was that going across these Pacific islands that they fought on as they approached the Japanese home islands, they encountered territory they'd never seen anything like this before, not even in the southern United States. And many of them were Southerners. There's another reason for that too. And so this elephant grass, because it grows as high as an elephant, is how it's called, has these very sharp edges and will just cut your hands up, and then you've got bloody hands. You're in the middle of a jungle, and basically everything gets infected, everything grows mold, and so on. So have a look at this.
open.
Drop back to slack.